What is null? Null is the emptiness of space. Heck, null is the universe before space even existed. Null is nothingness, the great unknown. Null is the absence of data. But let's not get too philosophical. Here are some examples of null. This is a null variable. In the past, we've always assigned a variable to a value, but sometimes we're not ready to assign a value to a variable just yet. Sometimes we just need to create a variable so we can populate it later, for example, inside an if statement. At this point, my string is null. And by the way, you can do this with any data type. Another example of null is when we explicitly set something to null. This is sometimes used to clear the value of a variable so you don't have any unwanted history. Here we're creating a null sObject data type variable, and here we're creating a null list collection variable of dates. Just like the number of dates in my real life, it is non-existent. Any data type, including sObjects and collections, can be null. Here are a few examples that are not null, but are commonly mistaken to be null. This string is not null. Remember, null is the absence of any value. But this string has a value. It's just empty. Being empty and having no value are two different things. You'll see why in a moment. This integer is also not null. It has a value, and that value is 0. 0 behaves differently than null. 0 plus 1 equals 1, but null plus 1 equals to an error. How do you add a number to nothingness? This lead is not null since it is a new lead record. Even though this new lead record has none of its fields populated, it at least is a lead. This list of cases is also not null because there exists a list of cases, even though it's empty. If this list were a bucket and it had no apples in it, at least you'd still have a bucket. In the scenario of null, you wouldn't even have a bucket. Now to explain why we make a distinction between null and non-null values. The null pointer exception, the most infamous error message of all time. No matter how good of a coder you are, you're going to see this message everywhere. The null pointer exception is as frustrating as it is humbling. But don't worry, it's one of the simplest errors to fix. Let me give you a rundown. Here's an example of code that'll trigger a null pointer exception. Here we're creating a new date variable, and notice how we do not set it to anything. Deadline is currently null. Next, we're setting deadline to the value of a field on a separate task variable. Finally, we use dot notation to add a single day to our deadline. These lines of code are generally pretty harmless, except for the darn null pointer exception it potentially introduces. Activity date is not a required field on tasks, meaning it's possible we're setting deadline to null here. Then we try to add a day to null. How do you add a day to null? Apex can't make a logical guess for what null is. If it simply defaulted a null date to today, bad things could happen. What if a bank was using Salesforce and for every null transaction date, it simply defaulted it to today? Havoc would break loose. Thus, the annoying null pointer exception here is actually our friend. It warns us ahead of time of danger so we can fix it. Here's how we'd write the code to avoid a null pointer exception. The first two lines are the same, but in the final line, instead of blindly adding a day to our deadline, we use an if statement to first see if our deadline is null. If it is, we default our date to a month from today. If it isn't, we add a day to it. Your two takeaways from this example are: 1, if statements are a great way to get around null pointer exceptions, and 2, null pointer exceptions happen often when using dot notation. In particular, dot notation instance methods where the instance is null. The lesson: be paranoid. Be very paranoid. It is a great skill to have as a coder. In fact, a coworker once joked with me that 75% of coding is just making sure errors don't happen. That's a big exaggeration, by the way, especially when coding in Salesforce, since Apex is generally more user-friendly than other languages. But the point stands. You're always thinking about worst-case scenarios when coding. Here's another example of a null pointer exception. First, we create a contact variable and set it to null. Normally, we say new contact to the right of the equal sign, but this time we're being extra naughty. Next, we attempt to update fields on our contact. Big no-no. How do you update fields of null? We need an actual contact to start with. So to avoid this error, all we do is make sure we create a new contact record instead of leaving it null. This principle applies to lists and collections as well. We need to explicitly create new lists, otherwise we'd be attempting to add values to null.